everybody. I am Aaron Simmons, and I know I don't look as sexy as Trip Fuller, but he is currently over in Germany, probably visiting Bonhoeffer's house or something. And I have got the opportunity to do this special episode of Homebrewed Christianity in his absence. We were going to do it together. Timing didn't work out, and so he is either on a flight or roaming the streets of Germany as we speak. So some of you know me. I'm a professor of philosophy at Furman University, author of the book Camping with Kierkegaard that actually started as a class that Trip and I did a few years ago here online, talking about walking with Kierkegaard and finding faith. And so it's wonderful to be back partnering with Trip on something that really, really is exciting to both of us, and we hope is exciting to you as well. So today, I'm doing this podcast episode with a good friend of mine, an amazing scholar, Rob Talisse, who I'll introduce in a second. But Trip and I are doing this episode as a kind of inaugural invitation to you all to join us for something later in the summer that we are calling the Democracy in Tension Summit. The tagline is Navigating the Interlocking Crises of Democracy and Religion. Now, as part of that summit, what we're going to do is have lectures from a group of distinguished scholars talking about democracy, political philosophy, philosophy of law, tensions that are agonistically embedded in how we make sense of religion and public citizenship. And these scholars are all recording 45-minute to an hour sorts of lectures. Those will then be made available to participants in the summit. And as we watch them together, Trip and I will be there doing live Q&A. And all the questions then that you generate and that you have and you reflect on after the fact, you can submit those to us. We'll then be doing podcast interviews with all the scholars throughout the fall, and they will then be responding to your questions. So if you participate in the summit, not only will you have this live engagement with Trip and I talking about these important ideas, but also then your questions will be the fodder that we take to then interview all of these distinguished scholars moving into the fall. So just a few of the scholars that are going to be part of it. Rob Talisse, who's with me today, Kevin Carnahan, a friend of Homebrewed who you probably met last year at Theology Beer Camp, David Scott, Tad DeLay, Beatrice Morovich, Aaron Stauffer, Elizabeth Henson Hasty, Rebecca Miles, and many, many others. So more information will be coming out soon. Trip will be distributing it through all of his usual channels, but keep your eyes open for the Democracy in Tension Summit, fostered and hosted by Trip and I here through Homebrewed Christianity. And we hope you will join us later in the summer as we think together about the crises that face us all and how we might find some resources for responding. So today, we're doing a kind of inaugural way of framing all of the issues that summit's going to be taking up. And I am joined with basically the most influential political philosopher on my own thinking. But before he gets cocky, that's not due to the brilliance of his thought. It's due to the fact that he knows how to distinguish between stoner metal and sludge metal and doom metal, and can do so with rigor. And so therefore, I figure anybody who can understand music that deeply and heavy metal that carefully probably knows what he's talking about also in political philosophy. Rob Talisse is the W. Alton Jones Chair of Political Philosophy at Vanderbilt University. He's also a professor of political science at Vanderbilt, has published very widely over a dozen books in political philosophy, many of which have graced the syllabi in my own classes and influenced my own thinking. His most recent of which is called Sustaining Democracy. And in this book, though, of course, I say most recent, Rob's probably got three others that have come out since, but Sustaining Democracy is all about why is democracy something worth continuing to be invested in? Is this actually an idea that we should continue to defend in a time where we talk about democracy being under threat? Well, why should we be concerned? It's kind of like years ago, I remember somebody saying, oh, we should defend Emerson as a philosopher. And someone raised his hand and said, well, but that might be like saying, no, you too can be part of a leper colony. So democracy might be something worth abandoning. And Rob tries to give an argument for why no, democracy is deep at the heart of not only human social engagement, but the wisdom traditions that inform us about how we live our social lives together. So, Rob, it is so good to be with you. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for inviting me. It's always good to talk to you, and looking forward to the conversation.
Well, I want to start off just by having you articulate a little bit of what you describe as this polarization paradox, this idea that part of what's problematic about the democratic situation we face is not that there is this threat from outside democracy, but democracy faces this sort of challenge from within its very structure. Can you say a little bit about what that challenge is and why that might animate this situation that we now face with democracy being under threat?
Sure. So, we might call it a paradox. It could just be a tension or a vulnerability. So, here's a platitude, right? Democracy needs participants. It's not a spectator proposal. It's a participatory endeavor. Here's another platitude. If you want to have an effective democratic voice, you've got to join a choir, right? You've got to build a coalition. You've got to get together with like-minded others to collaborate on strategies, on ideas, on processes by which you can advance justice as you see it, or your goals or your priorities as you best understand them. All of that seems essential to the democratic ideal. We need participatory citizens. We need them to band together in groups of common mind, common objective, common priority, so on and so forth. So that's part of what we're invested in when we're invested in democracy. Now, It turns out iterated engagements with your political allies, particularly of the very sort that's required of us, of democratic citizens, right? Collaborating, planning, organizing with like-minded others turns out to be bad for us cognitively from the point of view of some other democratic values. So there's the tension. Maybe it rises to the level of a paradox because the thought is that part of what democracy requires of us, active participation and coalition building, turns out to erode, to dissolve, to undercut certain of the cognitive and affective capacities that democratic citizens need if they're going to perform well in their role as participants in a self-governing community. Let me just say very quickly, fill in the sort of detail there. Use the word polarization, which is the right word. But let's sort of draw a very quick distinction, because when people hear the word polarization, they are almost always, instantly thinking of two parties, two units, two groups of people pulling apart such that the middle ground kind of falls out between them and then they can't cooperate and communicate. Now, that is one sense of the word polarization, to be sure. And polarization in that sense can be problematic. That's not the only meaning of the word. It's not the sense of the term that I want to call attention to. What I'll call belief polarization, or sometimes called group polarization, but let's go with belief polarization. The nomenclature here is really sort of hard to keep precise. But what we'll call belief polarization is a cognitive and affective set of dynamics that occur within a like-minded group. Polarization, in the sense that I'm interested in, this belief polarization, is not a metric of the distance or the divide between opposed groups. It's a dynamic that besets a like-minded group. You don't need two to tango to be subjected to belief polarization. There needs to be at least two groups for there to be polarization in this more popular sense. So belief polarization is a fascinating, but also very disconcerting tendency. Roughly, it's the yes man phenomenon. We surround ourselves with people who agree with everything that we say. We become more confident in those things that we say. We become more extreme in what we're willing to do on behalf of the beliefs that we share with these others who are constantly giving us positive feedback. Yep. And we come to embrace more radical formulations, more extreme formulations of the views that we hold. So belief polarization is this phenomenon where interactions among like-minded people turns those people into more extreme versions of themselves. More extreme in that they become overconfident, they become less risk averse when it comes to acting on behalf of what the group believes, and they become more extreme or radical in what they believe. Now, here's where this becomes problematic. It's not already clear. The more extreme you become, the more confident you become, the less legible will become anybody who doesn't share your view. It's going to become harder and harder to see critics as reasonable, as rational, as informed, as well-meaning. That is, the more assured we become of our position, the harder it becomes to see anybody who doesn't share that position. It becomes harder and harder to see them as in their right mind. Mm-hmm. Here's one way to put it in a kind of slogan. Belief polarization is a force that drives us to the view that democracy is possible only when everyone's just like me. And I don't know of a more radically anti-democratic stance than that.
Yeah. And this gets at what you sometimes will refer to as the like autoimmune reality that exists in democracy, right? That in the very attempt to defend democracy, to protect it against these enemies, both foreign and domestic. And in this case, you know, my neighbors with whom I have disagreements, their disagreements are not now just, well, they're wrong, but they are dangerous because they are unjust and they are threats to the very core democratic sensibilities that I and people like me, my friends, my group, defend. So how is it that this autoimmunity is something that's like deep within the very fabric of democratic society? You would think democracy is a guard against the very thing that you're describing as central to democratic life.
Yeah, you know, it's a puzzle. The explanation of how we got here is going to, you know, there's no unitary explanation for complex social phenomena in almost any sort. But let me just say one or two quick things. First, just to draw home a point that you just made. Belief polarized groups, in becoming more confident and assured and radical, do become less able to hear their opposition as reason-giving, as in their right mind, as well-intentioned. There's also this affective component, in addition to the ways in which extremity makes us cognitively unable to appreciate those with whom we disagree, makes us affectively opposed to them as well, in that belief polarized groups come to regard those who are not members of the group as not only cognitively deranged. In the United States today, we hear a lot about derangement syndromes, not only as cognitively deranged, but as morally and across all kinds of other respects, you know, lifestyle dimensions, depraved. So belief polarized groups come to see the opposition as monolithic. That is, in belief polarization, we lose the ability to hear difference among our critics.
Yeah.
We come to see them as always all saying the very same thing. We come to attribute to them only the most extreme and radical version of the opposed view, right? So we filter out and disregard moderate criticisms and hear all of our critics as only the most radical advocates for the opposed side. And we belief polarized groups come to attribute more and more behaviors to the people on the other side. They attribute those behaviors to their messed up political views, right? So next time, right, next time you get cut off on the freeway
Yep.
and have the tendency to project onto the driver a politically opposed identity. It's like that is a really, really strong tendency in us and not just a quirk of your own way of thinking about things. Or last point about this, think about how much of what passes for political satire and even comedy has to do with criticizing the consumer choices of the other side. Attention Walmart shoppers is the beginning of a liberal comedian's joke about conservatives. Right? Yoga pants, right? And oat milk lattes, right? Is the basis of probably a joke you could hear on Fox News tonight, right? And so you say, well, wait a minute. Now, our political opposition has now become a site where political identity, particularly partisan affiliation, has become the core identity that explains the lifestyle choices of our fellow citizens. So that if we're opposed to them politically, we have to regard them as living lives that are in some way fundamentally disordered. Now, I don't think that got to your question.
No, I think this is great. I should say, because I am also affectively tempted by that fact, that phenomenon, I have decided that, like, when people cut me off in traffic or I'm really frustrated at something, I will attribute it to the fact that they're probably Nickelback fans. And so
wait, Nickelback has fans?
It turns out, yes, and they're all Republicans or something, right? And so, but I do this actually, like, actively in my own life to try to remind myself, hey, as stupid as that would be, as irrational as that would be to assume that person who cut me off, well, it's probably because they like Chad Kroeger and think he's not a douche or something.
Right.
Well, it's similarly just as irrational to think, well, because these particular consumer behaviors or these particular political commitments, therefore they are not just wrong, but they are irrational and morally bankrupt, right? And this is important, though, I think, because the way that you describe this in your work and here in the work I've been doing a lot, and one of the most I think interesting thinkers for how to navigate some of this is a political philosopher woman named Chantal Mouffe, who, of course, you know very well. And Mouffe argues, along with some of your work, that this tension that animates some of this affective deployment, we might say, is actually a tension between two core values of our social existence, right? On the one hand, we have this deep, deep commitment to popular sovereignty. We have this deep sense that we are all in this together. My voice, being wealthy or poor or white or black or educated or not relevant to being, as you put it, self-governing individuals coming together in the hope that we can somehow make this thing work, right? We can achieve justice in this weird little ideal that we hold together.
Right.
However, that popular sovereignty commitment, let's just call it equality, right? This deep sense of equality actually runs counter to a liberal commitment. And here, for the listeners, I don't mean, liberal as opposed to conservative, right? This isn't the progressive commitment, but this classical idea anchored in the Enlightenment, people like John Locke and Rousseau and others that say liberty, freedom is so sacrosanct that it is, in fact, the single you might say, essence by which moral dignity gets off the ground. Right. So the only way that we are the kind of people who could be equal is because we are first and foremost radically free. But this tension between radical freedom, which says ultimately my voice is the only voice that matters and people who agree with me are therefore morally correct, is in tension with popular sovereignty, which says I actually have to find ways to take seriously that sometimes my freedom is going to be overridden in this process of navigating a social space where people will disagree with me, right? So do we navigate that reality of equality and liberty, or popular sovereignty and agency, being two deep commitments in what we call liberal democracy, and yet maybe democracy, sustaining democracy, protecting democracy may even come at a cost of requiring us to rethink that equation, right? Maybe we need I'll use some words that I'm not actually sure where I stand on some of this. Maybe we need a less liberal democracy, or maybe we need a radical democracy that rethinks what liberalism requires of us. Like, how is it that you see that tension playing out? Because it seems like that's what's going on in that affective, oh, I don't like your decision to cut me off in traffic. It's, oh, you lifted truck, Confederate flag waving, boot wearing, whatever. Like, suddenly now I've narrated that person as not only a person whose freedom does not actually constrain my own, but also somebody who's now less equal and not deserving of participation in popular sovereignty decisions.
That's right. So a couple of things here. These all seem like very fruitful thoughts that one could pick up with and pick up and run with. One thing that I think is important in your remarks just now is the realization that all politics, including democratic politics under the best circumstances. One more, including democratic politics under ideal circumstances, involves trade-offs. Yeah. That is just a fact about the world that people in our business, Aaron, I think are too commonly inclined to overlook the fact that trade-offs over things that really matter is just, that is the condition of politics. Yeah, that's what politics is, and that's why we need politics, because the world that we live in, our world, we could import religious language to make the thought to formulate. Our world is not a world of all sweetness and light. Yes, right. Our world is a world in which things have costs. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And not only do things have costs, there are trade-offs that are not properly characterized in terms of costs and benefits. That's right. Like the kind of trade-off you're just talking about, right? Where you say, well, politics is going to inevitably force us to make choices about equality and popular sovereignty and fairness. Yeah. And between those values, very important values, and certain kinds of other values, autonomy, liberty, privacy. Yeah. And I think you can read a lot in academic work, it's not just political philosophers, but, political philosophers included. You could read a lot in academic work that seems to not fully appreciate the fact that when we're talking about politics, we're talking about trade-offs of things that really matter, where it's just not clear that there's a certain degree of equality that is equal in value to some degree of self-determination or autonomy. It looks like that, that idea that we can always sort of balance the budget, normatively speaking, because, equality has a certain number, a certain value that it can be quantified attached to it, so we can weigh the loss of equality for the sake of a greater degree of liberty and have it equal out or have it optimized. That's just not the world we're in. Right. For better or worse, that's just not the world we're in. So I don't think that, here's one sort of quick entailment, and I don't mean to suggest that you were advocating this. I don't think that there's a way of designing democracy or any other political system that solves the problem of hard trade-offs. Right. I think that's just the human condition. Right here, right now. So let me just put the kind of tension that you were just characterizing in those sort of Chantal Mouffian terms Just put it in slightly different terms. I don't think that these are opposed, but the way I like to think of it is it just highlights a different feature. We might say.
Yeah.
Democratic citizens are under two kinds of obligations, right? That don't always play well together. On the one hand, to go back to the beginning of the conversation, Democratic citizens have a civic duty to hold their government responsible, to take ownership of their politics, to be active participants in the processes of, making a self-governing community work.
Yeah.
That means that we as citizens have a duty to think our way through questions about what would make society more just. What kinds of things that the government is authorized to do are the kinds of things that were they to do them, the country would become less just.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We've got to think in terms of this big value, and maybe not only the value of justice, but we just need to think in terms of big values like justice. Now, so we've got to take responsibility for the political world that we co-author.
Yeah.
That's one big sort of central core duty for democratic citizens. The other is that, a democratic community is not merely a self-governing community. It's a self-governing community of social equals.
Right.
Right? So we have a responsibility to one another, in addition to the responsibility to take ownership of the politics, the political world that we author. We have a responsibility to one another in pursuing justice. We can't lose sight of the fact that our fellow citizens, whether they agree with us about what justice is or not, they are our equals. We don't get to just boss them around. Yeah. Right? We owe them something. Right? Now, what we owe them is the stuff of a lot of political thinking. Yeah. Outside and inside of philosophy, sociology, theology, history, right? This is just a core question for people who think about politics in any disciplinary idiom. What do we owe to one another, given the fact that as democratic citizens, we are invested in one another's equality? Now, it just turns out that these two responsibilities, responsibility to take ownership, the responsibility to acknowledge the equality of our fellow citizens, there's a tension in this. Here's how to spell it out. And this is sort of, just the slightly different way from formulating it. I don't think Chantal Mouffe would disagree very much with what I'm about to say. Like, it's really hard, right? Especially when we're thinking about political issues that matter. Yeah. Not talking about who's going to be dog catcher in Nashville, Tennessee, right? Talking about healthcare policy, immigration policy, taxation, workplace protections. I mean, whatever your issue is that you are exercised about, you develop your view. It's not just the thing you want the government to do. Your view is not a view simply of the thing that you prefer the government to do. If you're doing democracy properly, your views about these big issues reflect your thinking about what justice and equality and dignity and autonomy and a whole host of other values require. Yeah. Once we see that, say, okay, it's very hard now for me to see my fellow citizens who've come to different conclusions about those issues. Yeah. We don't see them as merely on the other side of the question. We have to see them as on the wrong side. Yep. Right? Yep. We don't merely see them as mistaken about immigration. We have to see them as agents of injustice, because if they get their way, the world becomes our part of the world that I have to take responsibility for becomes less just. Right. Insofar as seeing my fellow citizens as my equals means, among a lot of other things, but at least means this: I have to respect their capacity to exercise their own judgments about things, including things that are really important, including things that affect all of us, right, within a democratic context and all the constraints that implies. It's really hard for me to say, like, yeah, you're wrong about immigration. If you get your way, Aaron, which is, I don't know what your views are on these things. Yeah. If you get your way, Aaron, the world right? Our world, our social world that we co-author becomes less just.
Right.
You're not merely wrong, you're in the wrong.
Yeah.
Right? So it's very hard. Let me just put it one more time in one different way. You know, what we owe to our democratic citizens is to retain the stance that enables us to see our fellow citizens as people who don't merely get an equal say, but who are entitled to an equal say.
Right.
And when I see you, as I must, when we disagree about something that matters, as not merely on the other side, but the wrong side, on the unjust side, it's very, very difficult to sustain internally the normative moral capacities to say, Aaron's on the wrong side of the question, but that in no way diminishes his entitlement to an equal say.
Yep.
That's the strained moral posture, I think, that democracy requires of us. And a lot of democratic thinking, a lot of democratic theorizing tries to figure out some way to massage that so that it ultimately goes away. A certain other strand of democratic thinking that I'm invested in says that doesn't go away. We have to figure out a way to manage and navigate that.
Yeah.
How's that sound?
That sounds right. I mean, so a couple thoughts. One, it sounds like you're suggesting, and your work argues this as well, that there is a fallacy that attends to the task of cure, right? You call it the curative fallacy. We're not going out there to try to solve this problem, to bring everybody together, put them in a room, pop out with some model that then gets rid of the disagreement, and we're all going to agree. And part of why then cure becomes more of a management strategy. How do we manage the cost that will always be enacted, right? There is no solution. There is no way forward. That's not going to be problematic at the level of some cost. And it's not just cost, you know, financially or economically or GDP. It's cost at the level of these core democratic commitments that shape our vision of why we should get in the room in the first place.
Right.
Now, it sounds like you've got then two layers. One is, which resonates with me very deeply, an existential layer. And this is this idea that we have to take seriously that whatever our views are on these things about, you know, social life and social policy, they are going to be nested in, reflective of, shaping our visions of the human condition, our conceptions of the good, our ideas about God and justice. So that existential reality comes out when you say, you know, I have to see the other person not just as holding a view, but entitled to a view, because their equality, Levinas would call it the face, is not one that I get to ignore because it is problematic, disadvantageous to my own interests. No, I don't get to ignore it because it would be immoral to do so. So there is this sense, not a thick theory of the good, but a vision of who it is that we are as participants in this complicated, always costly task, right? There's a kind of existential core here. But if the task then is to manage this tension, this paradox, this dilemma that you described, with an eye to there will be no final cure, how then can we make sense of this existential circumstance, existential reality in light of these social challenges? And it sounds to me that one of the traditional options, the traditional answers has been, well, we engage in just really good structured deliberative practice, right? We get better at politics because given that we're going to disagree, if we get better at politics, if we just educate each other well, if we use reason the right ways, surely we will all then see each other as these deliberative citizens who engage in these practices. And then people like John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas will have exceptions for the people who then suck at that, right? Or the people who refuse to participate in those ways. They become the unreasonable citizens. They become the, you know, people who refuse to participate in deliberative practice. But your account seems to be, look, all of those reasonable articulations of political strategies of management actually might fall back into this curative fallacy, because they are forgetting the existential depth at which these problems really lie. And so you tend to recommend a variety of things that are, hey, let's do less politics. Let's go bowling more, right? Like, and let's read Aristotle together, not let's go read, whoever the current political bestseller is. So why is it that in the face of this existential circumstance and this epistemic difficulty, your response is, we'll be better at politics if we do politics less, and we'll be better prepared as reason givers if we stop thinking that reason giving is fundamentally this political thing? It's really more like this human practice that we've got to foster in ways that are themselves maybe, apolitical in some deep sense. So is that describing kind of your view in broad shapes there?
Very broadly, yeah. I wouldn't resist anything that you said. Let's just unpack it a little bit. The curative fallacy stuff is really just, a kind of gripe I have working in some of the academic and non-academic spaces that I'm familiar with, that I'm sure you're familiar with as well as many others. The curative fallacy is this tendency to think that the way to address, solve, fix a problem that has already occurred is to enact the measures that would have prevented it from occurring.
Right.
So this is an attractive mode of reasoning, because in some cases it's a perfectly good sort of inference. Sorry, folks, it's going to get a little philosophical here, right? So Aaron,
in the deep weeds,
Aaron, you've got high blood pressure, right? Lower your salt. It's being caused by your high salt intake. Lower your salt intake. You lower your salt intake. You do the thing that would have prevented the elevation of your blood pressure. Your blood pressure normalizes. Sometimes the preventative is the curative, or is a guide to the curative. Sometimes. Here's another medical example, though. Sorry, Aaron, you're the guy who's going to be the example. Aaron, you have very serious heart disease. Had you been invested in a regimen of jogging 4 days a week for the past 10 years of your life, your heart would be in perfectly normal shape. But since you didn't do that, you've got heart disease. The last thing in the world you should do, Aaron, is start to jog.
Go run a marathon.
Right? You should not do that. That not only will, that will make things worse with your heart, and it could make things worse with other things going on. It could hurt you in other ways as well. Now, between those two cases where the high blood pressure case, the preventative and the curative sort of are aligned, in the heart disease case, the preventative and the curative are not only not aligned, but introducing the preventative once the problem has arisen is actually sort of not only exacerbating, but counterproductive. There's a whole range of other kinds of ways in which preventative measures and reparative steps can be organized. Lots of different ways in which they can be related. There's a whole industry in political thinking that is committed to the following kind of inference. Oh, democracy's broken because people don't listen. People have forgotten how to be civil. So let's figure out ways to get them to practice civility. Because had they been engaged in activities of sympathetic listening and role taking and so on and so forth, politeness, so on and so forth, they would not now have their uncivil tendencies. So let's try to give them practice in behaving civilly so that they might then become more civil. We just don't know if incivility is like heart disease or like high blood pressure. Right. So there's a lot of sort of fixed democracy initiatives that really are interested in figuring out how we could have prevented a dysfunction and then designing interventions that get people to do the thing they should have been doing all along. and the empirics on these things are mixed, and they should be, because the causal story, that's the right story to tell about incivility and tendencies to violence and dismissiveness and extremity. We just don't know what those stories are like. So we don't know to say like, oh, incivility is like high blood pressure.
Right.
Right. Okay. So that's one thing. Here's the other thing. And I like your connection to the existential stuff, which I embrace, but I'm professionally not qualified to assert in my academic work that this is existential. You might not know this. I got into philosophy in part by way of existentialism. I think a lot of people do, by the way. But anyhow, so here's the issue, I think. When we look at some of the major, not merely inconveniences and not merely the things that are lamentable about our current politics, if we look at the real dysfunctions, and here, I don't think that animosity is as such a dysfunction. I don't think that the temperature is high in our politics is as such a dysfunction. These are unpleasant things about our politics, that there's so much mugging for the camera, that there's so much theater, that there's so much rhetoric, that there's so much escalated hostility. These are, I think, unpleasant features, maybe lamentable because of unpleasant features of our democracy. I think the real dysfunctions, though, that are, I think, causally connected to all the elevated animosity, I think the real dysfunction, though, has to do with these cognitive and affective tendencies that disable our ability to understand how anybody in their right mind could be different from ourselves politically. That's where I think the real dysfunction lies. That we've become so ensconced in our own echo chambers, in our own political communities, in our own groups of like-minded and allied political actors, that the distinctive cognitive and affective capacities that would enable us to see people who stand outside of our communities, our groupings, as our fellow citizens who are merely wrong. We have to think that, right? This isn't a, don't sweat the small stuff. I can still see you, Aaron, as wrong. The dysfunction lies when the fact that I see you as wrong means that I also see you as unfit for democratic citizenship.
Right.
That's the dysfunction. Now, the existential part of it, at least my reading of the existential part of it, has to do with the fact that, we were talking about this a little while ago, that not only in the United States, but certainly most pronouncedly in the United States, political affiliation has become our central self-ascribed social identity. In the United States today, your listeners might be interested in hearing that. In the United States today, you're more likely to change your religion than you are to change your party affiliation once you affiliate with a party.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Negative attitudes in the United States towards cross-partisan marriage significantly outstrip negative attitudes towards interfaith and interracial marriage. Think about that for a second, right?
That's stunning.
You'd rather see your kid marry someone who worships a false idol than who votes for the wrong guy.
Yeah.
Right? Now, those are stunning indicators. We can go through more of the data here, but
it's crazy.
That'll be in the other thing that I do for you guys. You go through some of the data here, you're like, what's happened in the last 20, 25 years? Well, it's 30, 40 years now. I'm sorry. Geez, I'm showing my age. What's happened in the last several decades, let's say, in the United States and elsewhere is what I say, the partisan self has become our central social self. That's the existential element of this, that somehow if I don't get my way politically, I personally, Robert Talisse, has been dissed, has been degraded. Fundamentally anti-democratic attitude, by the way. In a democracy, it's like, sometimes you can't get what you want all the time. That's what a democracy is, right? Now, part of the positive strategies that you just mentioned on my part, right, are ways I see it as trying to counter this consolidation of partisan affiliation as our central self-ascribed, our central way of understanding who we are socially. And so two things that I recommend. One is a kind of overt attempt to recapture collaborative, cooperative activities. Not where we're suppressing our political differences. So this is not like a, oh, no politics at the table proposal. You might want to say no politics at the table, but that's not what I'm proposing.
Good advice for Thanksgiving as well.
Yeah, right. It might be a good thing to do, right? Suppress your, let's not talk about politics because we got to do something else. No, what I think we need to recapture is sites of cooperative activity where I just don't know what your politics are, not because we've hidden them, but because we're doing something else. Now, I've said this to a lot of different audiences over the years since I've been working on this stuff. And I know that when I say we need to find these sites for collaborative, cooperative activity where the politics of the other participants are simply unknown to us, people have a hard time imagining what that could be.
Could that possibly be? Yep.
And I want to suggest, Aaron, that the fact that this stranger imagination is part of the problem.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
That's the problem, that you can't even imagine
what it would be.
A collective activity in which you're just doing something together with others and you don't know what their politics are, not because we've suppressed them, but because we're just doing something else.
But this connects to your affective thing.
I'm sorry.
Right? I mean, this connects to your affective point, right? Yeah. Because I've already what they wear, how they speak, their accents, right? They confront me as already politically labeled, and then I've got all these judgments ready to deploy, right? So I'll give you an example that I think is actually. I've got an article I'm working on right now. There's a new book a buddy of mine's editing on philosophy and camping, and so my argument is camping is one of these spaces. And here's an example of what that might look like. This is a true story. Readers of my Substack, Philosophy in the Wild, have heard this story. But I was camping in Pisgah National Forest probably a month and a half ago. And when you camp these campsites, right, it's a campground. And so you're 20 yards from the next campsite or whatever. You can see the people around you. They're your neighbors, but there's also enough space that you don't go camping to be with other people. So you're kind of isolated enough, Well, the guy in the campsite next to me has a MAGA sticker on his truck. And so immediately I'm doing all of this, both judging, right? My affective account is in play. Not only a Nickelback fan, dang it, he's also a Trump fan. Like, this is what's happening. But also, I'm now resenting, and this was interesting to me, I felt myself resent the fact that he had brought politics into this space where politics does not fit, right? And I was mad at him. But then I started, my philosophy self kicked in. Well, who knows? Maybe he's one of those guys. Maybe that Trump sticker is actually from the first election. Maybe it's because he's got very deep moral concerns about abortion. And there was this argument that was a reasonable view that one could have. Like, I'm trying to find the hermeneutic charity to explain away, hey, I've got stickers on the back of my truck that I may not actually defend anymore. Who knows, right? And so I continue to set up my camp and everything's fine. But then it gets way worse. Like, when you're camping, 100% of what goes like on display has to be actively willed because none of it's there. When you leave, there's nothing but just a pad of dirt, right? So he strings this rope across two trees, which I'm thinking makes lots of sense. He's going to hang a tarp. It's his, clothesline, whatever. No, that's the line for the Trump flag that is every bit 6 foot wide. And so I'm watching this and now, like, actively trying to decide, well, how does this go? I'm actively committed to the idea that Trumpists are dangerous to society, that they hold views that I find problematic and not just wrong, but unjust. And they are, I'm holding these views. And this guy has decided here in one of my places of solitude, right? Like this is my fortress of solitude. If I were Superman, that guy has messed it up.
Right.
So I was indignant. I felt defensive in my posture. And so I'm getting some stuff out of the truck, and then something remarkable happened, and it pissed me off and yet wrecked me. So, you know, sometimes like you can feel that like something's closer to you than it should be. You know, it's like, I didn't know if it was a bear or a dog or what. And so I kind of like, you jump back and looked up, and this guy was standing, 5 feet away. He was walking down the little trail. And he says, with an accent that, again, I'm already reading in all sorts of ways, despite the fact that I'm from Tennessee and from the South and drive a lifted truck and all these things. Hey, man, I'm the guy I'm staying next to you. So I'd introduce myself. And so, again, I'm dismissive. I was like, hey, well, it's good to meet you, okay. And then I looked down and saw he had a Siberian Husky. Well, I am a huge Siberian Husky fan. I had one for a long time. My son exists because my Husky died. And so my wife and I decided to start a family. Like, the Husky is essential to who I am as a person. And I was like, hey, I really like your dog. I had a Husky. And then he said, oh, well, if you had a Husky, then you get it, man. You're a good one. So now our connection at the human level was because we are Husky affinity people. Okay. And then he did what pissed me off and yet was brilliant. He said, well, hey, man, you let me know if you need anything, you come on over, whatever's mine's yours. And I was so angry at this because I needed him to be an asshole. Right. And maybe he is in other parts of his life. I don't know the guy, but it turns out he was my neighbor and Husky lover before he was a Trump guy. Now, if he had not had that Trump flag up, my hunch is we probably would have ended up talking all kinds of things, right? Because he's right there. The camping phenomenon. Hey, do you have any extra, lighters? Hey, I need some sticks to roast a mark. Like, we start collaborating, and politics is so infinitely far from anything we are doing together. And in some ways, it's almost maximally socialistic in the sense that literally whatever I have that could help you and save your life in the woods, it's yours, man. Like, we find this commonality. And what then emerged was, because he brought politics into that space, I now found myself keeping a distance that was unfair and yet reasonable. Okay. And then when I found out who he kind of was, to my utter shock, he lives like a mile from me. We interact in other spaces in our daily life, right? So I agree with you that if somehow these other things, if we could just go camping, if we could just, go bowling, if we could just work together on an electrical problem, whatever it is, like I've got a guy coming to fix my refrigerator this week. I don't need to know anything about that guy because we're going to work together. In this case, he's going to work more than I will, but to solve the problem with my ice maker. Right. And we are human and we are collaborative, and that's what matters. And then the politics is kind of somehow secondary. Right. So for me, that is a hope, but right. I don't know if it actually, I've got some worries about it that I want to raise in a second though.
Yeah. So let me just say one quick thing, right? Because the story that you told, part of what concerns me is that these social spaces for collaborative activities where we can see one another's virtues in a way that's not already primed to be connected to an attribution of a partisan identity, these are disappearing.
That's right.
In fact, the first time I gave a talk about this stuff, was to a public audience, and a lot of people during Q&A had the same question, like, well, what kind of thing do you mean? These sort of like, non-political cooperative activities. What sorts of things are you talking about? And I very foolishly just said, I don't know, volunteer to, pick up litter from the park. And the response I got from the person who asked this was, that's a liberal thing to do.
Oh, good gracious.
Now,
Wow.
I had that reaction that you're having right
Oh,
now. I just looked at him and I sort of incredulously, nonplussed, just like
uh,
said, wait, it's liberal to not like litter in a park.
yeah.
And then I've just moved on. Now, I wish I had done something a little bit differently there and just said, well, what's liberal about it?
Mm-hmm.
Because think about all the things that this person could have been trying to communicate with that. Maybe it's
Yeah.
a liberal thing because it's volunteering outside of a faith community, right?
Right.
Maybe it's a liberal thing because it's about, an aesthetic, a neighborhood aesthetic thing rather than teaching kids how to read or feeding people who are home.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe it's sort of like, well, it's a liberal thing because it's this sort of like bougie, like, oh, I want my
Mm-hmm.
park to look nice,
Yep.
despite the fact that there are homeless people, on the outskirts of it that you're not doing
Right.
anything about, right? Like
Right.
it could have been all kinds of different things that were meant, and I just
Mm-hmm.
dismissed this guy as like,
Yeah.
like okay,
Come on. Right.
whatever. So, and again, the point here is not that when we find ways to interact collaboratively, cooperatively, where politics is out of the picture, we'll
Yeah.
come to agree on things, and then we'll see that politics is really small and doesn't
Yep.
matter.
Yep.
No, right? No, your political opposition to this guy at the campground is still,
Mm-hmm.
I think, still should be
Yeah.
as
Big deal.
vehement as it was.
Yep. Yep.
Here's the difference now. Because on the basis of these interactions that you had, which weren't about the absurd, like, MAGA flag that
Mm-hmm.
he decided was appropriate to put up. It's like, just hearing you tell the story, it's like, whatever your diagnosis is of this guy, whatever you want to
Mm-hmm.
say about this guy,
Mm-hmm.
you're not any longer able to see him as a completely failed human being.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
There's something redeemable.
Yep.
Despite all of the politics, despite the let's just say horrific politics,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Despite all the ways in which he's got bad political judgment, he has bad priorities, he's got the wrong sort of moral perspective on the country. He's like, say whatever you want to explain this person's political conviction. It's like you can't see it as having absolute depth now because the guy said to you, if you need anything, I'm here to help.
Come on.
Right.
That's right. His humanity was deeper. Right.
That's right.
But now let me ask you, though, because it's at that moment that I, as a Lebanosian, to the audience here will know, as a Christian, I think there are these deep moral commitments that, again, I do not, also make clear, do not think are somehow unavailable to non-religious persons. Right. But within my communities, there are these, hey, these are sacrosanct values that will define who we are, right? And I actually think that they are moral sentiments that should define us all. At what point, though, does the failure of the epistemic level, right? If we distinguished before between the, kind of existential and the epistemic, and they're both in play. If I encounter somebody whose reason giving has become so poor that their participation is now actively dangerous, not because just the view they hold, not because they are not a human, not because they are not able to stand with moral dignity, but because they are engaging in a practice for which they are so either poorly prepared or incompetently participating, they must be excluded from that behavior, right? We do this all the time. This is why 12-year-olds don't drive cars, because we say, nope, there's this kind of level at which you've got to perform certain things. We do this when it comes to medical practice without a license. There's real consequences for that. We don't let people teach at universities who don't have certain types of criteria that then allow them to be good. And then we review them repeatedly until they get tenure. Like, we have all of these checks in our social arrangements that say, if you suck at this, that doesn't mean you're not a person, doesn't mean that you're not a moral, value. It does mean you don't get to do this today. No heart surgery for you today, Rob, because it turns out you don't know how to do heart surgery. But if you say, no, I'm an equal, you're like, no, you're a moral equal, But right now, you are not a physician equal. Like, isn't there going to be some, and it may be a vague line, I don't know, but some line where we say, if you think RFK's not just but anti-evidentiary commitments about vaccine policy is a reasonable view for the leader of our public health community to hold, you now are practicing, literally in this case, medicine without a license. There has to be a consequence. There has to be an opposition. Like, at what point does, I mean, I hate to use this language, and I don't mean it in the sense of violence, but sadly, maybe that's what we're watching play out in LA, but where the principles of just war kick in, right? Where we say non-combatant immunity must be protected. And it turns out that these people I recognize as persons are threatening so much of the non-combatants. They are threatening so many of those who, in fact, are harmed by their behavior. This not just must be rejected, but it must be opposed, and they must no longer be allowed to participate because their participation is the very phenomenon that's creating the danger. Like, how do we, I mean, I'm not sure I hold this view, but I'm certainly walking up against it when I engage on Facebook daily, right? Like, oh my God, no, I can't. I see your moral dignity. I no longer can see you as a reasonable participant with whom conversation makes any sense, right? Like, how do we navigate that?
So this is a deep question. It's the, $5 billion question. Let me sort of draw just a few quick distinctions, and then so the issue I'm mainly concerned with is connected to what you are raising. So let me sort of say that and then speak directly to what you were raising. I think that the issue of what to do with those among us who hold the formal status of citizen with all of the privileges and licenses and duties that comes along with, who are committed either in a way that reaches what, a level of what we would call cognitive command, or who are committed because of their ignorance, bigotry, obstinance, or the rest, to wielding their shred of political power in ways that directly undercut the aspiration of democracy. That's an important issue. That's the issue that you're asking about.
Yep.
It's a slightly different issue from the one I'm concerned with, connected, which is that as good democratic citizens, we are subject to cognitive and affective forces that lead us to overpopulate our conception of who belongs in that category.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We come to see too many people as divested and irredeemable from the democratic perspective. We come to see mere disagreement with my particular views about issue A, B, C, D, and E as sufficient to render a person unreasonable in that Rawlsian sense, beyond the pale, right? A not merely an adversary, but an enemy in the Muffian sense. So I want to suggest, well, wait a minute. There are people who are radically divested from democracy, who are uncommitted to the ideal of a self-governing community of social equals, and who nonetheless hold the formal status of citizen. What do we do about them is the subject of the book I'm working on right now. Don't know exactly what I want to say just yet. But that's an issue, right? The part of the dysfunction that I see us as facing is the dynamics that are inexorable from democracy, because they're about coalition building and consensus building. The dynamics that lead us to see everybody who's not just like us as a member of the unreasonable enemies of democracy beyond the pale community. What to do about the people who are beyond the pale is an important question.
Yeah.
What to do about our tendency to see too many people fitting that description.
Yep. Yep.
Is the thing I'm interested in. Now, I just want to say one very quick thing. Another sort of tension that arises in our line of work, political thinking very broadly, is that democracy is partly an epistemological proposal, right? It has to do with processes of collective decision-making where people can share their information, talk it out, have their debates, try to convince and be convinced by reasons, in that old Solars, like enter the space of reasons with one another, right? That's all sort of cognitive, epistemic. It's aimed at people. Maybe we get better decisions that way. Maybe we get better inputs into the decisions that way. Maybe we get people who are just better informed, and downstream of that is some benefits for policy and all the rest. But democracy is also a pretty radical moral proposal, right? Yeah. It's the more, and by calling it radical, I mean to say it's not an easy pill to swallow, is part of what I'm saying, right? Democracy is the proposal that we could live together in political community as equals. That is, we could live together without bosses and kings and rulers and overlords.
Yeah.
And so part of the essence, I think, of that moral dimension of democracy is that as democratic citizens, as lawmakers, as elected officials, as public servants in the broader sense, the question we have to ask ourselves is never simply, right, what's the best policy? Who would be the best president or the best senator?
Yeah.
The question really is, what can I impose on others who are my equals?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that the person of bad moral judgment, who if they get their way, things get worse, right? The person who, maybe like your guy at the campground, who, for all we know, right, is in the grip of a bunch of conspiracy theories about, like basements in pizzerias in Washington, D.C., so on and so forth, which you say, look, he's got, on the basis of all of the stuff that he believes, he's drawn the right inference. He's just got all the wrong priors, right? Right. You might say that kind of thing. Say, wait a minute. Being a really bad political judgment doesn't mean that I get to boss you. It just doesn't mean that, right? Being misinformed doesn't mean that you're somebody's lackey, right? Or that you're just a piece of furniture in the social world that I can just sort of move out of the way. It's like, this is the radical, and I think difficult to swallow, right, feature of democracy, that those, with the exception of the people who are, let's just say, the unreasonable, the divested, the enemies, the beyond the, except for the people who actually fit that description, not merely the people who we suspect, but actually, so the Nazis, right?
Yeah.
Apart from those guys, it's like your average citizen of poor political judgment with bad priorities, bad values, poor understanding of what's in the Constitution, so on and so forth. Say, all that's regrettable. There's a problem there.
Yeah.
Political disempowerment, though, can't be the solution, because failing in all the ways that this particular kind of person is failing doesn't mean that they are merely a subject of legislation. They are still authors. Their political power is always coercive. Whenever the state does something, it's pushing somebody to do something that they otherwise don't want to do, wouldn't do, don't think they should have to do, so on and so forth. And the fact that you're deluded politically, but not yet beyond the pale, just deluded, doesn't mean that I just get to rule you. That's a radical thought into democracy for all the reasons why that you pointed to. It's like, we don't think of heart surgery that way. We don't think of universities that way. We don't think of anything that way. It's like, well, right, to be a heart surgeon, right, you don't get it. You don't have to be elected to be a heart surgeon, so on and so forth. Here's a way to think of the difference between the kinds of cases that make the analogy, I think, a little bit weaker than, that old Platonic analogy, right? Like, We wouldn't hold an election to find out what I should do about my foot. Why do we hold an election to find out what we should do about justice? Right.
Yep.
Here's where I think the analogy breaks down. There's a very narrow set of circumstances in which a doctor can say to you, Aaron, you need open heart surgery right now, and then force you to do it. Right? Force you to undergo the surgery. There are all kinds of moral reasons why you might be required to undergo the surgery. You've got duties to other people that entail a duty to take care of yourself, to save your life, to try to maintain it. There might be all kinds of moral reasons why you are required to do what the doctor has told you you must do. The doctor doesn't get to force you to have the surgery.
Yeah.
The government gets to force you to do stuff.
Yeah.
Right? That's the difference that I think makes the difference.
Well, and it's amazing because what it is that you've highlighted there is, to bring it all the way back to where we started, and then I have kind of a final set of questions for you. This is, I think, the existential stakes of belief polarization, right? If it turns out that I not only overestimate the warrant for my own beliefs, not only if I am resistant to criticism because I no longer consider the people with whom I disagree to be worthy of offering that critique because they are cognitively, disadvantaged in some sense. I now have positioned myself and my group as authorized to constrain, restrict, and maybe even eliminate the very democratic standing that I was trying to protect in the first place, right? So the belief polarization that we think is justified to defend the democratic intuitions that we have from the enemies of democracy actively make us the anti-democratic actors in a society. And as you said, now justify, ironically and tragically, the others' opposition to us as the anti-democratic forces, right? Like,
so belief polarization is a mirror that turns us into the worst caricature of us that is offered by the people on the other side. We're talking about belief polarization now. People talk about polarization, maybe even when they talk about belief polarization, they're almost always implicitly talking about the relations among opponents.
Right.
You have to talk a little bit about that, that's for sure. But what you've just highlighted, which I think is super important, is that belief polarization, it impacts us on the inside.
Yeah.
Right? It distorts our affective and cognitive capacities to reliably, right, represent other people.
That's right.
Allies and foes, right? We're also always talking about the foes. It's like belief polarization. Here's a really important thing that's often missed in a very extensive empirical and conceptual literature on belief polarization. Belief polarized groups become more internally conformist. Yeah. Right? Yeah. The more you hang around only with people who are just like you, the more invested you become in making them just like you.
Well, this, of course, this is Slayer fandom, right?
Exactly right. This is high school cliques. Like, by the way, like you say, like what we call peer pressure, right? Yeah, this is sports fandom, right?
Yes.
Like you show up at the stadium, like you spent an hour making sure you had all the right clothes, you're wearing the right colors, you learned the right chants, you figured out like what are the right gestures, what's the right merch, right? You watch a stadium full of sports fans. There's a whole lot of conformity behavior.
Yes.
And no, conformist groups are also more internally hierarchical. Yeah. They're less democratic internally. Definition. Right.
And you've also just described, just for the audience that's likely hearing this, religion. Yeah. Like, my goodness, the progressive, deconstructive, ex-evangelical kind of, religious left with whom I identify in all sorts of ways can become some of the most insular and echo chambery and resistant to criticism because they are reasonable in what they reject, right? Yeah. But that reasonable rejection can also create, then the only way that God could look is like what we Alabama fans or Slayer fans or Metallica fans claim, right? And that then ends up being not so much a, hey, look at us, we're so hospitable and inclusive, and that's why we've rejected those exclusivists. It's our vision of inclusion just excludes anybody who doesn't already get included in how we make sense of ourselves, right?
No, that's exactly right. And, again, I don't think that these tendencies can be exorcised from human beings. They can at best be managed. But here's the problem with the management task that you're now highlighting. Some of these sort of tribalist, groupish, sort of tendencies within human beings, when they're in groups of any kind, by the way, note, let me just sort of say one side note. Belief polarization is not a strictly political phenomenon. Right? You get your listeners might be amused to hear the following data point. You get a group of people together, all of whom agree that Denver, Colorado is notable for being especially high above sea level. The longer they talk about Denver, the higher above sea level they say it is. Now, that's not an evaluative, that's just a sort of a banal fact of geography that people get more and more extreme when they're talking with, Denver's great. Well, the air is so clean, it's so high, skiing's great, blah, 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 right? And then they start thinking that it's higher above sea level than they initially thought. But here's the thing that makes the management task difficult, because, it's easy to see these tendencies in others. Very hard to see them in ourselves. That's part of the problem, is that belief polarization, these phenomena that are connected to our groupishness and the centering of partisan identity as the way to explain every other aspect of our lives, they're stealthy, right? It's hard to detect in yourself. When people are behaving in the way you're just describing some members of the religious communities you're familiar with, when they're behaving in these ways that are homogenizing, conformist, hierarchical, exclusionary, unreasonably so, right? Self-congratulatory, cliquish, so on, however you want to describe it, chances are it feels to them like they're just being true, authentic selves.
That's right.
Because it's really hard, and they can very easily spot. By the way, I don't know as much about the examples that you're drawing from with religious communities, but living in Nashville, I've got a sense of this, right? I've got a sense of some of this where it's not uncommon to get the flavor just from walking past places of worship. That maybe not all, but many of them have as part of their doctrine, part of not their doctrine in an official theological sense. Part of what holds them together as a community is a slightly less than flattering conception of what the church across the street is like.
That's right.
And that's part of why you go to that one is because you think that they're right. The other side of the street faith community is intolerant, is too strident, is not flexible enough, is not welcoming enough, doesn't understand the right theological principles, whatever. It's like, so they part of it is what we in the political context called negative partisanship, where it's not that you're allied with your fellow, liberal, progressive, whatever it may be, on sort of environmental issues. You're allied with them on thinking that, right? The conservatives are the real enemies, right? That's right. That's the thing that holds you together is your distaste, distrust, dislike, dismissiveness towards the other side. And usually that dismissiveness is characterized in terms of the very phenomena, right? They're dogmatic, they're extreme, they're unwilling to listen to reason, they're in the grip of a syndrome, they've got false consciousness, they're in the grip of an ideology, right? They've got derangement syndrome. They're, by the way, our president, among other things that one might say about him, president is constantly describing his perceived foes in terms that attribute to them cognitive defects, the lunatics, right? Like, again, it's like, well, you don't get reasons from lunatics, so why even bother hearing them? Right.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
But those very dynamics, here's another way to put it. I think we're too ready to think that having the right political views inoculates you from cognitive and affective distortions.
That's
and
right.
it doesn't. Right. And it doesn't. Right. Being right about immigration and taxation and issues about gender and issues about the workplace and equality doesn't mean that you're any less susceptible to these groupish distorting dynamics. It's just we pretend that it does.
Yeah. Yeah. So this brings me then to maybe the last question for you, but it's one that I have been writing a lot about, and I don't know if you experience this or not, but like I write a bunch about something I'm trying to wrestle with, and I'm writing to try to figure out what it is that I can tell myself I think.
Right.
More than it is, there's the thing. It's like
you're trying literally to make up your mind.
To make up my mind, right? And the place where I most struggle to make up my mind right now is, so what then is the right, we talked about affect in this kind of performative dimension, right? Which of course speaks to what you just said. You go to this church because you don't like those guys. And so then pretty soon you'll start, of course, looking like somebody who goes to that church. Like, this is just how that's going to play out. But what about the affective response? And here I'm thinking like the emotional, the psychic, the maybe spiritual. What's the right approach, the right attitude? Is it hopeful, optimistic, pessimistic, despair, like what, resignation? I can't cure, but hey, at least I'm tenured at Vanderbilt. I mean, like, what is the, I mean, I struggle with this because, like I said, I'm trying to write this book right now about how not to give up, which is my attempt to think through this question for myself, right? The problem is when I sit down to write this book, I give up and I go ride mountain bikes, because when I start thinking it through, I almost find myself getting so overwhelmed and exhausted by the impossibility of anything having any real impact. I'm like, yeah, but at least the trails are pumping today, right? And then I go ride bikes and I'm like, oh my gosh, life is so much more and joy is possible. And yesterday I stopped at a pie shop in Asheville, and this kid was so happy, probably 20 years old, so happy to be at work that it almost made me angry. It's like, don't you realize capitalism's abusing you, bro? And yet all I could do was find myself loving how happy he was and how, like, so joy matters. And so then I say, no, I've got to write this book because hope is still possible. And, you know, when James Cone says hope beyond tragedy exists, and when Maya Angelou says joy is a birthright, and Cornel West in Democracy Matters says the tragicomic ability to find joy in the midst of nothing but despair, this is what anchors us in the democratic sensibility to begin with. Like, how is it that you get out of bed and tell yourself this is worth continuing to do, thinking critically, thinking carefully, participating in, you know, atypical or atopos modes of engagement? How is it that we affectively keep trying if it looks so hopeless?
So this is a deep question that you've hit on the sort of the angst buried deep in my psyche as well, because I don't do optimism, right? And I say in the trilogy of books that we've been talking around that I published recently, like, I don't know that we haven't painted ourselves into a corner. That what we are going to witness is a gradual but escalating and accelerating deterioration of the fundamentals of constitutional representative democracy. And what's on the other end of that looks to me like something very ungood, right? Very not good. Or as my niece, when she was a little kid, used to say, kind of not good so much. But, so again, So I don't do optimism. I don't think with a lot of people in our biz, right, our political thinking biz, so if we could just get the process right, if we can just get the institutions right, if we can just get the policy right, democracy's smooth sailing. I don't think democracy is ever smooth sailing, in part because, as we've been talking about, I think it is subject to an autoimmune sort of disorder, right?
Yeah.
Some of the things that are required of us actually undercut some of the other, our capacity to do some of the other things that we need to do well. Exactly. So I don't see an optimistic upshot of any of this. I do see some cause for some hope. And here's an analogy that might resonate with, I know will resonate with you. If you think for a moment of the idea of religious tolerance and the achievement, right, of that norm, right, where you can imagine, it's not quite the same, but there's an analogy here, right? Imagine a religious believer. Salvation is the most important thing. I've got a duty to try to help my fellow souls achieve salvation, or at least avoid damnation, right? That's subordinate to every other thing that could be good in the world. Nothing else is good except in light of this ultimate thing, beatitude, right? Whatever the right language is for your tradition. And then say, and somebody who's theologically wrong is somebody who's setting themselves up to fail at salvation, whatever that might mean for your tradition.
Right.
But nonetheless, here's the achievement of the norm. Nonetheless, there are real restrictions, pretty tight restrictions on what I'm permitted to do. There are restrictions of a political and social kind of what I'm permitted to do to help this person achieve the most important thing anybody can try to achieve. It's like that strikes us today as not even such an odd stance to take. It's a pretty common thing. I mean, people working in sort of philosophical theology and in philosophy of religion, right? There are all kinds of different ways. Some people oppose this kind of thing. Some people tweak it in various ways. But nonetheless, it doesn't look to us like it must have looked to people some centuries ago as just an inconsistent a posture it was impossible to take, because those first premises just are incompatible with the conclusion about there being restrictions on what you can do to help somebody achieve salvation. But this all seems to us like mainstream, religious traditions that thrive in liberal democracies sort of accept this kind of without comment. It's just like, well, people have to find their own way to Christ. People have to find their own way to salvation. We tell stories about it and all the rest. You can tell the John Lockean story and toleration. Right? You can't convert somebody by force. That's not how real conviction works. But it's just, we have to tell a story. We might find ourselves telling a story, but it's not a non-starter in the way that it probably would have sounded to somebody living in the 1500s, right?
Yeah.
It's like, that's an achievement.
Yeah.
It strikes me. It's like that is that we can learn how to live with, navigate, manage certain kinds of trade-offs among things that are really, really important.
Yeah.
We can do it.
Yeah.
I think democracy is one of these things that we've just grown accustomed to not seeing the trade-off that's implicit within it. And if we could understand the trade-off a little bit better, maybe we would be better at managing the costs of what gets lost. I'll just give you one, maybe you have these experiences yourself. Both of us have the privilege of talking to young people a lot about the stuff that we know about and think a lot about and are excited to talk about. One thing that I've noticed comes more of a revelation to young people than it was when I first started in my line of work. So when I say to them things like, being right about politics doesn't mean you get to get your way.
Yeah.
Being wrong doesn't mean that you lose. thinking hard about the right political views doesn't give you any greater bit of influence.
Yep.
The people who are wrong, it would be wrong when the votes are counted and the wrong side wins. Government is required to enact what you have to see as an unjust policy, right? These sort of like hard realities, brass tacks realities of democracy sort of don't loom, just sort of come as more like revelatory, like, oh yeah, I hadn't quite thought of it that way before.
Yeah.
Saying, no, we are invested in the ideal of a self-governing community of social equals. We like it sounds beautiful. It does. It is beautiful.
Yeah.
But scratch it just a little bit. It sounds like a David Lynch movie. You scratch it just a little bit, and there's something kind of really unsettling about it.
Yeah.
That doesn't make it less beautiful. It just means like, well, wait a minute. There's something here that needs to be navigated, managed, explored. We gotta pursuing this ideal is not just a cakewalk to some great thing. It's going to involve real winners and real losers, right? Real gains and real losses.
Yeah.
So that's part of it. It's just like, we got to realize what we're invested in, and then maybe some of the tensions won't be so damning, right?
Yeah.
I think, let me put it that slightly differently. I think the despair that is paralyzing versus the despair that we can find in Cornel West, for example,
right?
The former kind of paralyzing despair is the despair that comes from having accepted a sweetness and light version of democracy and found out that it can't live up to that ideal.
Yeah.
The despair that you get in Cornel West, in Camus, in other, like in people who struggle, right?
Yeah.
Frederick Douglass, right? Is right. It's like, no. The struggle is the despair comes from the struggle in the absence of any conception of democracy being able to achieve sweetness and light.
Yeah.
That's why it can still be motivating, right?
Yeah.
You're in the middle of it, and you can make it could get better, it could get worse, right?
Yeah.
That it's not perfect is not itself news.
Yeah.
Here's the second thing I would say. That connects with some of the broader things I'm concerned with. Politics can never love you back. The important people in your life can love you back.
Right.
There's a certain sense in which the other projects of your life, artistic projects that have to do with your community, projects that have to do with things that you find precious and valuable and worth nurturing, the project of being a good parent, the project of being a good spouse, the project of being a good neighbor, these Williams-esque kinds of projects in our lives can love us back, can reaffirm us, right?
Yeah.
Politics can't. Politics will never love you back. So the point is that in the midst of fighting for a more just social order, for doing your duty as a democratic citizen, as a participant, as a co-author of a localized social world, it's important to not lose sight of other things of value whose value is not ultimately describable in political terms and cultivate those things.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a little bit of what went on the campsite.
Yeah, no, and that's a wonderful place to land today, because I think part of what the homebrew Christianity community has managed to do, and thanks to Tripp in his leadership for doing this over the last decade, it's an attempt to say, hey, when we come together and think with each other about things that matter, this doesn't mean that we're going to solve some problem, but it does mean that we will anchor as much of our finitude as we can in doing the kind of stuff that is worth doing, right? And the way you describe this resonates with me in two different ways. One, readers of mine will know that I define faith, kind of drawing on Kierkegaard, but the way I put it is faith is risk with direction. And the whole point of that is to say, you don't get rid of the risk ever, right? Like, having faith is not, now I have no risk because I'm loved by God. It's
Right.
no, now I understand what Simone Weil means when she writes that love of God may in fact play out as understanding what affliction means as an existential reality, right?
Yeah.
And so this idea of risk being essential not only to our existential human condition, but it's also essential to our democratic social circumstances. And yet, what direction is worthy of our hope, worthy of our finitude, worthy of our effort? And I think that that's ultimately why I keep coming down saying, yeah, I also am not optimistic, though I should say the phrase, I don't do optimism, might be the most, how do you say you're from Jersey without saying you're from Jersey? That might work.
You can take the boy out of Jersey. You can't take the Jersey out of the boy. Yeah.
But I agree with you. I am so not optimistic. I may even in some moments be pessimistic, right? Like may even say, you know what, I think this is worse than we think. I think we might actually be screwed. But the hope is, to put it in theological language, again, given this sort of complicated audience, for me, hope is most profound when it is eschatological, which is the idea that is not yet the case. Therefore, it is hope. And yet it is already active in transforming my behavior now, right? And
it's deeply William James.
Yes.
It is a deeply Jamesian,
very Jamesian
conception of what religiosity is. In fact,
that's right.
Right.
That's right.
That's the what he called the strenuous mood. Right. Yeah.
And that seems right to me. So to everybody listening, I hope you will join us for the Democracy Intention Summit, Navigating the Interlocking Crises of Democracy and Religion, that Tripp and I are putting on later this summer. Again, more information will be coming out. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation with Rob Talisse today, because it does such a good job of hitting on all of the reasons why we need to be even more invested in not just thinking about these things, but thinking about them with each other in communities that are not first and foremost defined by political allegiance, but are instead defined by seeing each other's shared humanity. And so, Rob, thanks so much for being with us. It's been an absolute joy. To Tripp, I hope you enjoy your time in Germany. To everybody else, I hope I will see you at the Democracy Intention online summit later this summer. I'm Aaron Simmons. Before we leave, Rob, anything that you would want them, like where can they find you? Anything that you'd want them to check out? Anything that you're doing or talks that are coming up that they should be aware of?
I'm easy to find. I'm easily Googleable. My social media presence is a combination of political observations about the academy, and clips of me playing punk rock on guitar.
I think if there was ever a better sales pitch for this audience, I cannot imagine what it is. So definitely check out Robert Talisse on all of the social media platforms. For me, if you want to get connected with me, the best way to do it is just my website, jaronsimmons.com, or you can also hop over and hang out with me on Substack at Philosophy in the Wild. So until next time, thanks as always for listening to Homebrewed Christianity. Thanks to Rob. Thanks to Tripp. We'll see you guys next time.
Thank you.